basically. Yeah, whoever has questions, either they can shout it out and or raise your hand and ask it in the Q&A, and then we can kind of take it from there.
First question was Kripa.
That will be a no. It's gonna be interesting to see how this goes. It's a little bit different than Michael's session and all that. So
yeah, and we can unmute people if people just want to talk and ask questions. If you want to talk and ask questions, just say me or something, either in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll unmute you and meet the expert.
So Kripa, tell us about how Vsphere works.
That was me. That's all you. I no longer exist in this equation.
And this is for an hour, or how long is it for?
It's for an hour and a half, but take as much or as little time as you need.
Got it. Okay.
Oh, hi.
Hi, we have a question, William.
Yes, it's my first session, and sorry.
Welcome.
I will. Yes. I can introduce myself. My name is Eugene. I'm from one of the biggest provider, Vsphere Api, from Russia, and we create a lot of script or something like that for our environment, because we have big environment. In our opinion, it's more than 1,000 of ESXi host, a lot of vCloud and Nfxt and something like that. And I am an operation engineer, and we try solve usual operation problem. For example, one of them, it's collecting information about firmware, drivers, and something like that. And of course, I love PowerCLI, and we have own system which collect all this information. But I faced this problem many years ago, and nowadays too, I see them that Vsphere don't have API call for working with fiber channel HBA card firmware. I couldn't get through PowerCLI. I understand reason, because it is inside kernels this information. It's not easy for get it through API. I can do this get driver and firmware for network card. It's easy. It's with ES6CLI through PowerCLI, and it's normal. But what I can do with fiber channel adapter card, I don't want to use SSH and go to host and execute command from USR bin and something like that. I ask this question in different in Slack and in user voice about PowerShell, and I never get answer. Maybe you help me. Sorry for my
That's
English.
good.
It's
Yeah,
not
no,
my native.
yeah, no, that's a good question. I definitely get it. I haven't done fiber channel in a very long time, actually. But it's a very common question that we get for different types of network drivers and or firmware. And so there's a couple of places. I think if you're collecting it via ESXCLI today, there are ways of kind of consuming that kind of programmatically. PowerCLI is just one implementation of it. There are lower levels interfaces that you could use. It's not necessarily a public API. So if you're comfortable with working with a SOAP-based interface, you can definitely interact with that. Another option is to look at, depending on your device and what level of firmware you're looking at, there is some firmware information available as part of the Vsphere Host System Manager APIs when you look at the different devices, especially for the storage devices. And so when you go down that path, there generally is some information there. So depending on your platform, because I've worked in past systems with like EMC systems where some of that firmware is actually available through the API. So that's one option to take a look at if you've not taken a look at there. There's also some work happening in this space where we're trying to unify all the different ways of collecting and aggregating drivers and firmware specifically for the hardware vendors and ensuring that we have that information in our northbound APIs. And this is some of the work that we're doing with our Vsphere Lifecycle Manager solution, VLCM. Some of that is to not only help you identify drivers and compatibility and compare that with our HCL. So there's been a lot of work done in that place. But there's also lower level information to work with the partners to make sure that that information is bubbled up in a way that can be consumed through our modern RESTful APIs. So there's actually quite a bit of firmware information that's available using the new REST APIs for VLCM. So again, depending on your piece of hardware and the whether or not it's on the HCL, I know that this week they announced a couple of more vendors like HP, for example, having that information available. So you may be able to get some of that through that mechanism as well too. And I can pull up some references because I've had to do some of the driver lookups in the past for the SOAP APIs. So some of it is there, but again, it is going to be very hardware dependent. And so if you're getting it through ESXCLI today, that information is definitely there. And I think there are different ways of bubbling that information up depending on which commands you're using to retrieve it.
Okay, thanks. I know answer about Vsam. Yes, it's because I gave this question on yesterday on VMworld session.
Right.
Yes, it's very good, but only on next version, on 7 version, and of course only with special hardware vendor. Yeah,
it'll depend. Some of it you might get the information just out of the box, and so I think one suggestion is to deploy a Vcenter 7.0 release or even 7.0 U1 when it is available. Attach one of your hosts. It can be 6, 7 or greater, and actually take a look at the RESTful APIs and see if that information is actually available, because it probably is going to be part of some of that information as part of the LCM APIs, and there is a kind of reporting set of APIs for product catalog and the interop report. And so if you're familiar with that set of APIs, you can actually get some information, and then you can kind of get a sense of whether or not that driver information is there or not. So yeah, it is a chicken and egg part. Is if some of it may require some additional packages, some of it may require just a newer version of ESX. And so it's very possible that once you upgrade to this particular new version of ESX, we're able to basically pull all the information out there and then make that accessible at a higher level RESTful API.
Okay, thanks. I
Sure.
understand the answer, but may I give some additional question to them because maybe only my question on this session in this technology base article, in the notice down, it's special command, which I understand the answer about right way, and for understanding current version of firmware driving and something like that. And with Vsam, it's clear, it's future, okay. But I won't collect running configuration on driver which and firmware which runtime on host it's real time. And in this KB, in this article I see special command like this special for native driver. It's dump its kernel tree of native drivers. I don't know how this in English. And I can at this place I can find current version of firmware, but it's not structure, it's only text like Linux style and no.
Yeah, like I said, a lot of this information can be retrieved in a number of different ways. And so if you want to have a programmatic and consistent API, it's going to be VLCM. That's going to be our story for that. In the current matter of state, yes, the information is going to be found in different parts of the interface. And here, what's listed in the KB is specifically around listing our native drivers. And yes, you can use the ESXCLI. You can look at a number of places to give it to you, but you're not going to get that consistency. And so if you do not want to use SSH to run some of these commands, then there aren't that many real options.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Any other questions? So the way I'm kind of tackling this is that if you have a question, feel free to either shout it out or raise your hands, and then we kind of go through it. If it's depending on time and number of folks that have questions, we can dive into some code if you guys want to take a look at that. If you have some particular problem, we can even have you guys share your screen and we can kind of look at the code that you've written so far, things that you're trying to solve. This is really open up for you guys and your guys' time. If not, it's going to be a pretty boring an hour and a half, right? So this is really your guys' time. So you guys came here for a reason. So feel free to queue up your questions either in chat and or just raise your hand, and then Kripa can unmute you. Okay, let's see. Great question. Okay, so let's see. I see one from D. Matthew. We are looking to replace our on-prem lab environment to maybe VMware Cloud AWS, but not sure about cost and if we build use case to have it in the cloud versus on-prem. Yeah, great question, D. Not necessarily automation related, but I can talk about it since I work on VMware Cloud. Costing, it's all a perspective ultimately. I think you need to look at a number of factors. What's the cost of running your infrastructure and hardware? Is that a full-time staff where you have an operations team that's constantly having to monitor it, patch, upgrade, and what does that cost? I used to be a VI admin, and we had a dedicated data center team, and we had an operations team. And when we talk about costs, folks quickly jump to the initial CapEx cost, but what's really going to bite you over time is really the operation cost. I think a lot of you guys probably are already aware of that. And so depending on that aspect of it and whether or not you own a data center, are you leasing a data center? Is the lease coming up? Are you geographically separated? Do you want to have more locations? So there's a lot of factors on costing. And so, really you should run the numbers. We do have a VMC sizer tool. So let me pull that up to be able to plug in some of your numbers. And you can take a look at kind of the workloads that you're looking to move, because sometimes not all customers are looking to move every single application out there. So for example, you might just move certain types of workloads that you're interested in running in the cloud, or you might have a new project that you want to kick off and you want to be able to take advantage of some cloud services. So for those options, you might be able to move a subset of those workloads to take advantage of something, say like a native service like S3. I was recently doing some work with like Azure and Google and taking advantage of their natural language services. And so they're really good for some of those things and easy to use. So you might move a part of your state. So we see customers in a couple of categories of either doing full data center evacuation, where they've decided as a business that running IT is not it's not adding additional value to them necessarily. They see the value of adding new services, developing new applications and experiences, and so they want to completely evac their data center. Freddie Mac's a good example of that. We have other customers that want to do data center consolidation and or actually expand their organization, right? In this new, strange COVID world, we have organizations that might be located in one part of the region and actually have customers worldwide. And instead of having to open up new data centers or leasing out data centers that's near some of these customers, whether it's for security, auditing, data locality, they're looking to the cloud and actually, moving some of their workloads in a state to kind of service those customers. And then ultimately looking at the services that they're looking to consuming. So you might be considering, AWS for some of the native services that they have available, but you might also consider other cloud providers from that manner. So take a look at the VMC sizer, take a look at the types of workloads. There's a number of ways of collecting the information. You can, put in the information through this tool, and that's kind of like a best guesstimate. Usually it's not going to be very accurate from that point of view, but you can kind of get a high level understanding of like how many hosts that might look like when you're subscribing to VMware Cloud AWS. We also support other data collection mechanisms. So you can use live optics, you can use RV tools actually from the community. And again, the more data that you can provide, it'll give you an approximation of the number of hosts, whether you consider multi-region, something as simple as having HA and spreading your workloads across multiple regions. Something to consider if you were to do this in a traditional data center, you have to think about the egress cost of replication traffic, maintaining that dark site, because most customers are not using the DR site actively. And so with the new offering from like Datrium, for example, right, you can kind of do this on-demand rehydration of your workloads. And so there's a lot of cost savings when you think about it purely from a cloud standpoint. So again, it's not a trivial thing like, hey, it's going to cost this amount of money. And so a lot of times folks will just look at it and just like, oh yeah, it's three hosts. I can do that quote unquote cheaper on-prem, but they forget about all the operational aspects of it. Hopefully that's helped answer the question. Awesome, great. Let's see, do you guys know who the next question was in line?
I think it's Eugene's. What is the future of Viva? Is it becoming a part of Vsphere?
Awesome, great question. Yeah, so there's, we kicked off the Viva project almost 2 years ago, kind of launched officially last VMworld, and it's just gotten an amazing amount of traction, from our customers. So really thank you for folks that are using it. We're also seeing a lot of interest from our ecosystems and even more interestingly, internally from our different solutions and all that. So if you've taken a look at the Viva session this week, we talked about some of the things that we're working on, like a new provider. vCloud Director is the next provider that we're building. And we're certainly open to other solutions as well. And we've actually been getting a lot of questions around like, where is this going to live? And one of the things I'm actually kind of interested wanted to kind of get your thoughts on, Eugene, is, where do you think it's best suited? Today, our prototype was really focused on vSphere, because that's kind of in a lot of environments and there's a lot of rich information. But Michael and our goal is really to be able to provide, truly event-driven automation for many of VMware's products and services, not just vSphere specifically. And when you think about it from that point of view, it may or may not make sense to have it as part of vSphere. You may have it as a decoupled service. And if you take a look at Viva itself, right, it's this virtual appliance that today talks to vCenter, collects these events, and then very easily, right, without writing much code at all, that even understands the vSphere APIs and how that works, you're able to write, just enough code in any language of your choice. So that can be PowerShell, Python, Go, Ruby, whatever it may be, to execute that business logic, right? A very simple example is, VM gets deleted. I want to be able to get a Slack notification. I get a failed login, maybe it files a PagerDuty ticket, right? In all these examples, you're really just writing that minimum business logic, right, to solve a particular problem. And this really resonated with customers. And so when we start to talk to them about the different ways that this can be manifested as an offering, they really like the ability to run these functions closest to their workloads and our services. To give you an example, you might have a function that talks to your CMDB service. Maybe you're talking to an IPAM system that you have, or maybe an internal portal. In that case, you want these functions to really run closer to your on-premises environment. We have another set of customers who are leveraging the public cloud, storing things in S3, Slack, Microsoft Teams, and they're running these functions closer to these cloud services. And so, and we have other customers who then have many vCenters, right? Anywhere from 2 to 100 actually, who've deployed Viva, and there they have a management problem. It's like, how do I deploy these instances associated to each vCenter? Because today, Viva is a single mapping from one Viva instance to a vCenter server. But if you remember earlier, I mentioned that, we're looking at other event providers. And so trying to deploy these appliances, mapping into vCenter server, it may not be very scalable. And so some of the customers are super open to having some type of a managed service where you have visibility of all these different vCenter environments and even other types of VMware products and services where you can start to map out the events, discover the events that you're interested in, map the functions and that execute a particular piece of business logic. And that could technically run on your on-prem environment. It might even be able to run in the cloud. So for some customers that are running on VMware Cloud and AWS, they want to talk to some public cloud services. So you can imagine we can decouple the execution of the function with the management. So you kind of get this overall unified management interface. And if you watch the session, you'll see kind of a hint at a UI that we're working on that will give you this visibility on a per vCenter basis, but you can abstract that away where it can be kind of like a service, right? And as you add more vCenter servers, you can start to map these different functions. You can also map who gets access to these things. And so there's a couple of ways that we're thinking about that this could potentially be productized, but I'd love to kind of hear your feedback. Having said that, Eugene, if you have any thoughts on, how might you like to see that, if it were to be productized, or is this something that you'd like to see productized to begin with? And feel free to unmute yourself, or if you've been unmuted, I guess.
We only looking for Web for our business logic, and I understand the situation with one Web appliance to one vCenter mapping. It's not problem for our environment we can create. And my second question about Web was about integration with Harbor or something like that for publishing function more comfortable if you have a lot of appliances.
Absolutely. Yeah, so today when you set up a function mapping, right, it actually maps back to a Docker container. And this is why it's so powerful, is that you can bring any language of your choice and be able to run that inside of a container, for those that are not familiar with the solution. And today when you deploy a function, it's in this very simple YAML. It basically just maps to an endpoint. Today we're mapping to Docker Hub. But if you had, say, a Harbor registry that's private, you can actually map to that, or you have any other registry that's accessible. So the only requirement is that the Viva instance can talk to that registry, for example, right? And so you can already do this today. In the future, we're looking at an integration where you'll be able to point to a repository. Today, we're planning on supporting kind of public GitHub, so we have a number of function examples out there. So if we already have a couple of that map to PagerDuty, to Slack and Microsoft Teams, and so instead of having to rewrite that logic, right, using this new interface, you can actually say, oh yeah, there's a repo that's available on the public GitHub website. I want to subscribe to that function, and you can deploy your function immediately, right? That's one option. For customers that have some functions that are maybe that's more specific to the organization, or maybe these are things that they're not looking to share, we do have another option of basically pointing to a GitLab repository. We've seen a couple of requests for that. And so you have the ability to point to either a repository of functions, or you can, today with the existing solution, you can just simply point to your registry of your choice, and that's really encoded in that URL. So rather than referencing a Docker Hub entry, right, it just be your FQDN of your registry and the function that you've pushed to your image, and then it will go ahead and pull that Docker container and then execute that on the Viva instance. Hopefully that helped answer your question.
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for your time, Eugene. Let's see. Do you have the next one up? I'm trying to scroll.
Yeah, the next one is on Kush's. He has two questions. The first one is there changes in VMware Object and PowerCLI? As we know, from 6.7 to 7.0, different code is implemented.
Okay. Okay, I see. Yeah, so the answer is yes, there are always new objects from a PowerCLI standpoint. Both, are you asking from an API, or are you asking for kind of like net new PowerCLI commandlets?
Specific to the APIs, like if we want to use the SOAP-based APIs, so in that sense.
Yeah, let me see if I see. Are you guys able to see my screen here?
Yeah, I can see the screen.
Okay. So here, so this is the, oops, I guess we can't read that. So this is the Vsphere API. So there's kind of two different APIs, right? We have our traditional SOAP API, been around for over 2 decades. We still continue to have net new functionality introduced in there. One of the nice things about this API when you first get to the homepage is that there is this kind of what's new. It's not always known, it's a little bit hidden, you know, if you come to, but if you just go to code.vmware.com, you can search for the Vsphere APIs. And so we have our traditional SOAP API. And for every major release, we do have kind of like a what's new section. So you can quickly come in here and see what are the new managed objects. So for 7.0 specifically, you know, we have 2 new objects here, assignable hardware capability and this site info manager. You can see all the different methods and all the different properties. So you can actually browse through and see what is available, and you can easily toggle this for different versions of Vsphere. We have the same exact thing for our code.vmware.com, or sorry, the REST API, and that is a new site under developer.com. And if you go to that API reference, right, you'll be able to see some of the new APIs. And over time, you can see when they were introduced and the specific functionality. So for example, as part of 7.0 release, we have these new LCM, VLCM APIs I mentioned earlier to the gentleman asked a question, right? So I can come in here and I can see, hey, these are the new methods, and I can see all the information in here. And over time, you know, we're also revamping our developer experience. And so you'll start to see really nice things of like release notes, being able to get different delta diffs between the different methods and APIs, and so be even more clear in the future from an API standpoint. And I think there was there a second part of the question?
Second part of the question specific to serialized replication. So currently in PowerCLI or Python, I couldn't find any SOAP-based or REST-based API for the replication. So do we have any plan to bring the replications also into the script part?
What kind of, anything in particular about Vsphere replication? There's a bunch of functionality. Are you looking to set up Vsphere replication? Are you looking to determine if a VM is being replicated by Vsphere replication?
If the VM is being replicated by the Vsphere replication. Example, if I want to monitor the incoming and the outgoing replication on my daily day-to-day basis as a part of health checks. So how do we do that? Right.
Yeah. So there's a couple of places. SRM has some information about Vsphere replication. And so there are some PowerCLI interfaces. And so if you're using Site Recovery Manager from that interface, there is some information about VMs that are getting protected. There are some metadata about VMs that are getting protected by Vsphere replication. I don't recall if it goes into great detail. So let me see if I can pull up that blog post that has information about that. So yeah, so when a VM gets protected by Vsphere replication or most backup solutions, there's generally metadata that's decorated on the VM object. Sometimes it's via tag, sometimes it's in the annotation. But in the case of Vsphere replication, there's actually net new properties that we actually amend to the VM object model, if you're familiar with that. And using that information, you can actually determine, you know, which VM is actually being protected by Vsphere replication. And there is some metadata information. I just don't recall offhand because it's been some time since I've touched that. But if I can find it, I will share that out here. See if I can quickly find it. If not, I can always take that offline and drop you a note. But in generally, you know, this is actually one of the most frequently asked requests capability for automation. It's something that, you know, we fed into our storage business units and stuff, and we continue to do so. You know, I think they're looking at overall automation and trying to figure out, you know, where it might make sense. And so all I can say at this point is that, you know, it's definitely something that I will mention to them, and hopefully they will look into that in the near future. Yeah.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, let's see where to find that article. Okay, let's see. Thanks for the question.
Next question. Why Vsphere on AWS over Vsphere on Azure? What are the functionality differences?
Great question. Yeah, there's a couple ways of looking at it. I think the first and foremost is kind of what are the services that you're looking to take advantage of when you're moving your workloads to the public cloud. Like I said earlier, some customers are migrating their workloads to be strategic in terms of reducing their cost of ownership. It's to reduce the need for physical data centers, right? And to really take advantage of the public cloud. In other cases, customers are looking to migrate, certain workloads that they understand quite well, and so start to transform some of their applications to a more cloud native application. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to completely rewrite the application. They might say, hey, I've got this application that's running. It's talking to a legacy system, and I want to be able to create a mobile-based application. And I want to be able to take advantage of the net new frameworks, maybe some cloud storage, S3, maybe some AI ML services, right? And you can quickly get to that scenario, right, by having this kind of hybrid approach and or moving the workloads to the cloud. And so there, you're really looking at what is your business goal at the end of the day, right? Is it to take advantage of these cloud services? Is it to reduce your footprint on-prem? We've had customers that are, still talking to, legacy array systems, and they have these front-end applications that live in AWS, and they're taking advantage of these cloud services. So from that standpoint, and they might have like a business relationship, right? That's another key thing to consider. And so when we talk about these different VMware Cloud solution, that's something that you should definitely consider. Other differences between the solution is that if you look at VMware Cloud and AWS, this is a joint partnership, a joint engineering partnership that we've worked with AWS. So we've done engineering work behind the scenes to not only get our software running on the AWS Nitro hardware, but we also have this really tight integration in some of the capabilities. So for example, EDRS, right? We're able to understand your workloads, and based on certain thresholds that are configurable by customers, we'll automatically hot add a host or hot add remove a host, right? When your capacity is breaching. We've also done a lot of work around the networking, right? Once you go to the cloud, something that a lot of folks forget about is that, networking is no longer free, right? In a traditional data center, a lot of your traffic is generally your east-west traffic. When you start to move to the cloud or you start to tackle hybrid, you start to really exercise your edge devices, whether you're egressing out of your data center or egressing out of your VMware Cloud infrastructure. And there is a cost associated with that. And so some of the work that we've done is this cross ENI adapter configuration that allows us to tap into AWS's backbone infrastructure. We're the only ones that have done this to date, right? And one of the benefits, I'll give you a really concrete example. We spoke with a customer a couple of years back ago where they were having to basically go and look at a bunch of images and video content that they're storing historically, process that information, and then send that back out to a customer. They were afraid by when going to something like a public cloud, all of a sudden they're having to egress a lot of this content out to their app servers, right? That are running a different colo data center. And one of the things that you can do today in VMware Cloud and AWS specifically is that because of this cross ENI and this kind of joint engineering partnership, you can actually store as much content in S3. So generally when you upload content to S3, it's generally free. This is the same for almost all cloud vendors. It's only when you start to egress that back out, that's where there's a cost. And when the customer kind of heard about this capability where both egress and ingress is actually free in VMware Cloud and AWS because of this kind of cross VPC linking, and we're able to tap into the backbone, the customer is now able to actually take this application, store all their information in S3, right? Do that computation, and then only serve out the content that they actually need to their application. So it was a very different business model by simply going to the cloud and kind of understanding like, hey, there's this unique capability that's available in AWS. And there may be others, for the different hyperscalers. When you look at the services, maybe there might be a particular service like an AI service that you're building and that's maybe really resonating, whether that's Google or Azure. And so it's not just kind of the versions for version. There are some differences there from a services standpoint. And also if you look at the SDDC version and we look at VMware Cloud and AWS, because we're doing this joint partnership, we're many versions ahead. And so that means that you get brand new capabilities, things that you're just seeing in Vsphere 7.0. We've had a number of these capabilities already running in VMware Cloud and AWS a number of releases ago. And so when you think about VMC, you're actually running a newer version of the stack, vSphere, ESX, Vsan, Nsxt, much newer than what you have on-prem. Now we are compatible with all the versions that are shipping out there, right? But you do get the benefit of newer APIs, newer functionality, and customers really drive the roadmap for that. When you compare and contrast that with maybe something like an Azure, Google, and other hyperscalers, they are shipping the current GA versions of our software. So today I know for the new AVS solution that just launched, I think just this week, they're still running on our 6.7.U3 stack. It's a VCF stack, right? So it is not the exact same version, and there may be certain capabilities that you're expecting there that may not be available. So there are a number of different things to really consider functionally, but also the capabilities that you're getting from the cloud services. hopefully that helped answer your question, Laurent.
We have another question in the Q&A. It's a little longer, so you might want to see it as well. But how might we automate VM lifecycles where we don't have vRealize automation handling it all? Are the APIs for content library and other aspects robust enough to pipeline the VM lifecycle stages?
Common deployment.
Creation from an ISO to common deployments with minimal human touch.
Yeah, there's a number of ways. I mean, VRA definitely is quite powerful, especially with their blueprinting capabilities and the integrations that they have with different offerings. But a lot of it is orchestration. There's some governance that's available for VRA. And so if you don't want to rebuild all of that functionality and you want to kind of start to add in additional business value and the different integration, really, that's really the value of VRA and being able to span that across multiple types of infrastructure. We have a lot of folks here. I see a lot of common names. I think I saw Luke and Kyle in here earlier, and including myself, right? They're all leveraging the lowest common denominator, which is our vSphere platform APIs. So it all depends, right? You can upload your content in content library. In content library today, you can deploy the VMs, you can customize the VMs. It's all through our RESTful APIs. And so you can certainly go from 0 to fully customized VM. It all depends on what are your constraints. So in the past, we normally would automate the creation of a VM, patching it. Today, there's actually a lot more options, right? Before, you would traditionally use a OS specific automation. So for Linux and Solaris, where I used to work in, these are basically your kickstart, your jumpstart kind of automation. Windows has an equivalent of that kind of automation, right? Once you've built out that template, you would then start to rely on traditional OS level automation. We do have something called guest operation. So if you wanted to kind of use VMware specific technologies, we have the ability to basically go into the guest OS after you've installed VMware tools and to basically instrument any type of operation that you might be running within the guest OS. And this means that you can run, SSH commands, you can run PowerShell, you can run any code you want. It's a really, really powerful capability. So you can actually do your end-to-end configuration of the OS, including application deployments. Now today, there's a lot more tooling that's available. So when you start to stand up a template, an image, right? Folks might be using things like HashiCorp Packer. Really, really powerful tool, because it's not only can you take that, codify your deployment, but you can actually check that into source control. And so if there's a new version of Windows, and they actually support a number of operating systems, right? And so it's really taking advantage of the native tooling that's available for your guest OS specifically, and you can easily automate that. And I know that there's a number of VMware people that are using Packer to deploy kind of their golden image template. And then they have some CI/CD pipeline that can either be driven from traditional GitHub, it can be Jenkins that uses the APIs to take that and import that into content library, turn that into a VM template, right? And then now that becomes your golden image, and you can then drive additional automation using the REST APIs for content library to go in and deploy that VM. And we actually new capabilities of like check in and check out. And so you can actually extend that further and start to do CI/CD. That's the world that I've come from. I used to work for Salesforce.com, and we were provisioning anywhere from 10 to 15,000 VMs per day. And we did this exact same automation, right? We had an automation that built up the images. And unfortunately, content library at the time did not exist. If it did, we would take advantage of it. And so there are definitely a number of different ways of kind of slicing it. It all just depends. Do you want to build this from scratch? Or do you want to take advantage of some solutions out there like Packer, like Terraform, like VRA, for example, that has a lot of this integration out of the box, and you're more of designing the blueprints, the applications, and then you hook that into kind of like your CI/CD tooling for deployments. Did that help answer the question? I need to breathe, Luke. I only have an hour and a half, man. Come on. Okay, let's see. Do we have any other questions coming in? Any serious questions? Not from Luke. What are you doing here anyways? Are you just giving me crap? Any other questions? Any other windows I'm not seeing, Kripa?
Nope, none that I can see. Feel free to ask questions, you guys. This is what we want use this time for.
Yeah,
it's really hard to it's really hard to pull William aside in a real VM world and ask him questions. So the fact that this time is here is awesome.
Yeah, this is your guys' time. I mean, I'm assuming you guys all came here for a reason. If not, however much time we're having, I'm going to be checking my mail and all that, maybe working on some automation. So love to get any kind of questions, things you guys are trying to solve. If somebody's stuck on something, got some code, happy to jump on that as well too. It just depends. I wasn't sure if folks are ready to jump in, share what you've got, but happy to take these questions. This is one of the things I really enjoy as part of VMware when we used to be able to physically do it, right? Is to connect and kind of hear some of the challenges, some of the things that you guys have solved maybe. That's always very interesting and kind of sharing that with others. So feel free to, shout it out, raise your hand, drop in Q&A, drop it in chat. So many different ways to ask questions. No questions? I'm going to start asking my own questions. So since there were a couple of questions, is this?
You have one new one.
Okay, let's see. So we're starting our on-prem and micro-segmentation efforts now. I need to pull in info from a CVD. Are there any common tagging, taxonomy papers, case study examples we can look at? Yeah, so there's actually, I'll do you two better. When you say tagging taxonomy, are you referring to Vsphere tagging? Are you referring to Nsxt tagging? Or feel free to, I guess, type it out, or if you want to.
I'll talk. So both, because we want to pull our Nsxt tagging partially from vCenter, and we want the vCenter tagging populated from the CMDB.
Okay, three-way. Okay, yeah. I've seen other variations of it where some customers are building Nsxt tagging and they want to synchronize that with the vSphere tags, or vice versa. So in terms of vSphere tagging, yeah, there's definitely some best practices, especially around performance. And there are some maximums to be aware of. There's actually a Vsphere white paper on tagging. And in fact, there's actually a tagging session at VMworld that's been pre-recorded by our performance guru, Ravi, and the product manager around that. So there's probably some changes in that. So there's definitely some content out there. Now, in terms of synchronization and different techniques, I'll kind of describe some of the ones that I've seen. When you look at Vsphere tagging, pulling from CMD is a very common workflow, right? And so that's something that you can describe. Most CMDBs have some type of automation interface, ideally, and you can kind of synchronize that. You can do that either on demand. It really just depends on how frequently you're changing. I've seen customers where they will pull information from their CMDB and have it as a one-way sync from CMDB out to their vSphere environment, and then their deployment mechanism will be aware of those tags and start to consume them. We've seen other types of customers where they are doing the exact same model, right? Syncing from CMDB out to vSphere, but they're also, as these workloads are being deployed, they might get tagged with app owner, location, SLA, criticality, even applications. We've seen some customers take tagging to the extreme and start to say, for this pizza virtual machine, it's running this operating system, and these are the apps and the versions that they're running, and they actually want to associate that metadata with the virtual machine, so that when they do troubleshooting, reporting, they have all the information immediately there with them. So for those customers, they're actually taking that additional metadata that's been generated for the deployment and actually resynchronizing their CMDB. So we've seen the reverse, where the CMDB might just provide the basic information like hostname, VM, and location, and the rest of the unique information is actually being sent from the vSphere layer back into their CMDB. So there's kind of this bi-directional synchronization process. In cases where customers are trying to do DFW microsegmentation, workload migration from on-prem to the cloud, where they might have Nsxt, they might not have be, they might be using third-party, IDS solutions. There, same concept, right? They're able to synchronize either from their third-party tool directly into Nsxt. There's some federation work that's being worked on for Nsxt Policy Manager API. But there is a solution out there today from one of our VMware Cloud teams where they're actually synchronizing their tags from Nsxt from the vSphere layer. So it sounds like it kind of fits that model. And in the Nsxt world, the tags can actually be applied in sort of three different mechanisms, right? The first one is attaching a tag based on a VM object. Now, one of the downsides of that is that if you have this workload that needs to move, you can't really predefine all these DFW rules, meaning that the workload might go from a secured environment to maybe slightly more opened up environment. Now you might still protect it with your edge firewalls, but it doesn't have all those DFWs move with it simultaneously. So if you create an Nsxt tag that's associated with that VM, that's one of the downside. Now, another option is rather than associate that with the VM object, right? You can actually associate it based on a tag, right? And so you can actually pre-create all these DFW rules to say, hey, if this VM has this particular tag or has this particular layout, I'm going to apply all these rules by default. So when I move that workload or when I create that workload to begin with, right, instead of having to attach to that object, it will automatically inherit those DFWs. And so we've seen both those scenarios happen. And so we do have that solution today that's not using Viba today, but I know that they're looking into, taking advantage of Viba and kind of figuring out when a VM gets tagged in vSphere, automatically synchronize those tag categories and items into Nsxt, so that way it's available via another automation platform. So there's a couple of mechanisms for tackling that scenario that you can take a look at.
Thank you very much.
Yep, appreciate it. Let's see.
We have another question in the chat.
Is it the last one right there?
Yeah, it is.
See, do we have anything similar to RV tools in PowerCLI, like repair the objects or check the sync? I'm not familiar with RV tools with respect to repairing objects and checking the sync. Can you describe that functionality? I'm familiar with RV tools. I wasn't familiar that they had a repairing objects, or were you looking for that information?
In Vsan, my point was specific to the Vsan. If any object gets stuck, so at that time, usually we will have the ESXCLI Vsan commands, which we use to do the repair of the objects. If sync is happening, then we will monitor. So what I used to do is I put the ESXCLI into the PowerCLI and try to do that. But that process will take a lot of time if I try to compare between the actual ESXCLI and the PowerCLI ESXCLI. So do we have any direct objects or any good way to track those things? If any object is in stuck state, and how do we repair those?
Yeah, I saw this question come up earlier a couple of days ago. There have been some improvements around kind of like just the speed of object recovery. That's more of a Vsan capability. So the API is the same. So this is available in the Vsan Management APIs. There are, so PowerCLI can hook into that, or any other SDK for that example, right? So you can actually get the information and actually initiate the repair. In terms of the performance and the time it takes, it's really going to vary from environment to environment. I know that there's been a bunch of improvements around how we do object recovery and speeding a lot of that up. I don't remember the exact details. So it could be also version dependent on your Vsan environment, where you might have to repair these objects, and it's taking a little bit longer as well.
But usually to improve the speed, we use the get-view and then try to use the SOAP and the REST APIs. But in case of the Vsan, if we are trying to use this functionality, the performance will not get improved. Like it will still same, and sometimes it takes ages to respond.
Yeah, so that's not necessarily true. So in PowerCLI, we do have high-level Vsan command list that allows you to repair the objects. And it all depends. It's not clear to me whether it's a client side or if it's potentially the environments. But just like you have a Git view for the low-level APIs for the Vsphere SOAP API, for the Vsan Management API, we have the exact same. It's the Git to Vsan view commandlet, and that actually will open up the raw Vsan Management APIs. And so there is a managed object specifically for the Vsan manager for some of these things. So you can call into lower objects, and they are task-based, and so you can get information for that. So I don't want to say it's necessarily a high-level commandlet versus a low-level commandlet. It's possible that it's could be the version. So again, something worth taking a look at. If you are able to reproduce this, strongly recommend filing a case with GSS to see if they have any details for versioning. But from an API standpoint, the high-level commandlets are calling into the exact same functionality. In this case, you're really repairing an object, so there's really no main differences other than ease of use of the functionality. It's unlike if you were to do like a Git VM, right, where you're actually retrieving a lot of information, and versus you doing a Git view and just saying, I only want the VM name, right? So in that case, there is a difference in performance, right, of how you call that API. But in the case of something like a repair object or checking the sync, it's a pretty straightforward commandlet mapping to the underlying APIs. And so I don't believe that that's really the case that might be causing the either performance that you're seeing or perceived performance issues.
Okay. And one more question specific to the folder structure. So what I used to do is, if we have any orphan folders, so we will go to the folders, create a view, and do the business logic calculation. If the folder is not being used, mark this as a orphan folder. So do we have any plan or the specific property which can mark as specific folder to orphan folder? Like, we don't need to define the business logic and do the calculation.
When you say folder, what do you mean by that? Are you talking about like an orphan folder?
Yes, orphan folders, yes.
Well, so the difficulty with that is that what is an orphan folder, right? When you look at a data store, I can create a folder that when you create a virtual machine, you get obviously a folder. You might have other folders that aren't mapped to a virtual machine. So for example, very common, I'm sure you guys all have it, you might have like an ISO folder. If the environment's brand new, maybe you might not upload an ISO. It's really hard for VMware to determine that ISO folder, would you consider that an orphan folder or not, right? So there's no real construct mapping to it. So there's not clear logic that I think we can easily determine that a folder is not meant to be used as a generic container of files or ISO files. And if you think about content library, you know, now you're storing all sorts of other type of content that is probably not a virtual machine related. So for those reasons, it'd be very hard for us to say, oh yeah, that object is a quote unquote orphan object and mark it as such.
Okay. Yeah, but I was asking in the context of the Vsphere replication if I want to check. So my folder will get created. Sometime what we do is the replication is not happening. We have to stop the replication and re-trigger it. So it will ask whether you want to do on the same folder or different folder. If person chooses a different folder, the previous folder will mark as a orphan, and we will not have any idea to do that. So either we need to go with a script or to find the business logic to find those folders. So in that context,
it sounds like this orphan I'm not too familiar with the orphan concepts. Is that something that's specifically to vSphere replication? Because we don't have a concept of like orphan folders from a vSphere inventory point of view. Yeah,
it's specific to more vSphere replication, where the folder, another folder will get created when we do the force replication.
Yeah, no, it's a great piece of feedback for the vSphere replication team, because again, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. I don't have anything specifically I'm aware of that we're improving anything from a vSphere layer, but yeah, this is something that you may want to feed into the vSphere team if you're talking to a product manager or support to potentially get an enhancement from that point of view.
Sure, thank you.
Yep, thanks.
You have a number of questions in the actual Q&A now.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. Looks like Brian, is that the next one? Yeah.
Yeah.
What is the future of VRO? Will only be available for legacy backwards
Oh, sorry, Brian. I clicked on something. Can you read?
I think Kripa gave the answer. Where did that go?
Go into answer. You can.
Yeah, let me just unmute Brian.
Yeah, or yeah, feel free to ask the questions.
Okay, I just wanted to understand where VRO will be in the future. Do you see it only as a legacy or backward compatibility tool, or will we see some enhancements for it, or will it be a strategic product in the future? So will there be a modern editor, for example, and so on?
You mean a modern editor? What do you mean by that as a modern editor?
I mean that until now I only used 7.6 and the old Java editor is really bad, yeah, just to is it a project that is strategic and will it be evolved over time?
Right. It's a good question. I don't work in our cloud management business unit. That is the business unit that actually owns vRealize Orchestra, as well as our vRealize automation tool. My understanding is that it is still very strategic to our customers. A lot of customers are still using VRO. Today it is one of the primary mechanisms for extending VRA workflows and to be able to have that extensibility to be able to run any piece of code, whether that is native VRA workflows to maybe running PowerCLI or even running other types of pieces of code. I think one of the things that they're looking at is also how do we make it more extensible in the future, not just with vRealize, but when you look at the vRealize automation stack today, they're also supporting other more native integrations. So rather than having VRO be the main interface, and JavaScript may not be for everybody, it certainly isn't for me when I think about automation for myself. And so depending if you're a workflow orchestrator type of a person, you may just want to consume automation directly and have that deeper integration. So I know that they're also looking at other types of integration, for example, doing work with Terraform, CloudFormation, Ansible. You just saw the acquisition this week with SaltStack. And so VRO is not going anywhere. I know many customers are still using, in fact, a lot of customers that are migrating their workloads to VMware Cloud AWS or even doing a hybrid model, they're actually continue reusing their VRO workflows. And again, that's one of the benefits of being able to leverage what you've invested in there. Now, in terms of whether or not VRO, if they're going to have a modern editor, I really don't know. That's something that is really going to be derived from feedback from customers like you and others. They're probably better suited to kind of answer, what the lifespan is. But I have seen, differences of the UI because I had recently deployed it, and they completely revamped their interface to become an HTML5 interface. A lot more snappier, better support for VMC. So there's definitely active development, but I can't speak to kind of how far they're looking to change up the interface and specifically the editor.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thanks for your question, Brian. Let's see, is Michael, are you the next one? Let's see, in LCM, is there a way to import VIBs and images to a repository or a central local repo using CODE? Yeah, so and when you say LCM, are you referring to Update Manager, or are you asking about the new vSphere Lifecycle Manager component, Michael?
I think he's saying either. I just saw another message in the Q&A.
Either one's fine.
Oh, either one's fine. Well, so
Update Manager is what we're currently using, but either one's
right,
fine.
yeah. In VUM, well, so if you take a step back, when you look at both Update Manager and LCM, what they're really operating at are these depots or repos, and there's a couple of new names for these solutions, right? And so generally when you have a VIB, you're really installing that specific on a host. But when you start to think about these repo, they come out as what's known as an offline bundle. And that is really the format that we expect content to basically get imported and or downloaded to these solutions so that you can create brand new image profiles. And similarly in the VLCM space, I forget what they call it, but it's no longer a VIB. It looks and smells like a VIB, but it's what we call a component. And then within that component, you have multiple pieces that start to break out the personality of your image, not just the binary, but there's also the configuration aspect, right? And so all of that together becomes your overall configuration and desired state. And so for VUM specifically, you're not importing a VIB, you're really importing an either image profile. So this is like an ESXi image. If you're talking about like drivers and VIBs, then they come in the form of an offline bundle. Generally, VMware will distribute those drivers that you download from myvmware.com as an offline bundle. Same thing from our vendors and stuff. If you do get a VIB, generally that might be maybe a custom VIB or maybe somebody that's built the VIB that wasn't designed for importing into VUM, for example, and that's something that you want to go back to the particular vendor. Generally, all of our partners have all the tooling to produce the appropriate format files. And then from an automation standpoint, using CODE, yeah, for Update Manager, the interface is really going to be through PowerCLI. We have a number of commandlets that will let you operate, with the image builder and to be able to construct these different image profiles, export them out, et cetera, et cetera. For VLCM, we do have modern RESTful APIs, and so you can interact with our online repo. You can also host your own repository, and similar for VUM, right? You can talk to this external repository. And again, we have RESTful APIs that cover all the functionality that you see in VLCM's UI.
Yeah, the biggest challenge is just I have, 46 vCenters I have to try to maintain and Update Managers with them and just trying to figure out ways to keep them synced.
Yep. Yeah. And generally, the solution around that is deploying something called, UMDS, Update Manager Service. And I think in 7.0, if I recall correctly, they added a Linux virtual appliance, or at least support for Linux. And so you can easily stand up this update server. And generally this is for customers who have firewalled environments or dark sites basically. So they'll go and download all the updates and bundles into like a central laptop or a system. They'll then synchronize that into the UMDS service, right? And you can think of this as kind of like an HTTP repo that has all these different drivers and binaries and ESX patches with some metadata wrapped around it. And I believe the same format is the same for VLCM from a repository standpoint. And then instead of downloading these patches into each individual VUM repository, you can actually point all your different VUM systems to this UMDS repo. And generally that's how you kind of manage dark sites or sites that are not disconnected to the internet. That way you're not having to basically duplicate the content, and more importantly, kind of manage each vCenter independently from a patching and lifecycle standpoint.
All right, thank you.
Yep, thanks for the question, Michael. Let's see, Bishop C, can you synchronize vCenter and Nsxt tagging? Yeah, there's, I think, a question, yeah, it was a question that was brought up similar to the question. You definitely can. There's no automatic synchronization, so there are some automation that you have to write. Like I mentioned earlier to the gentleman, we do have a script out there that will go ahead and synchronize tags from vCenter going up to Nsxt. And you can certainly take a look at that piece of code. It's done in Python, but you can easily do a similar example using PowerCLI or any other API surface to synchronize the tags that way. Another potential use of the vCenter Event Broker appliance is actually looking at vCenter tags, and as they get created, you can automatically call into Nsxt API. So that's kind of more of a automated, self-driving operation point of view, right? So you're not having to explicitly run it, because one of the challenges with keeping these in sync is how frequently are you running it? Is it running on a job schedule? Do you have any conflicts? So these are some things to consider. There's nothing out of the box, but it's something that we hear all the time, and customers basically write some automation based on their requirements, right? They might take vCenter tags, push them up to Nsxt. It might be a mix of vCenter tags and maybe some CMDB information, and then that gets pushed up into Nsxt. So definitely possible with the tools that we have today. Let's see. Any other questions? It's a comment. Were those?
There's two more in the Q&A. I don't know if you can see them.
Oh, I didn't see these. Let's see. So let me take a look at the first one. In terms of alarms, notifications, and triggers, as well as roles and permissions in any given scenario, do you have PowerCLI code and export this in to be used to build new versions? It's just a different solution, achieve the same results. Yeah, that's a good question. Roles and permissions. I think I did a session at VMware, I think maybe almost 3 years ago, where we had talked about this thing. It was in the context of migrating from a Windows-based vCenter to a vCenter server appliance, but the concept holds true, obviously, for scaling out new vCenters. There's a couple of options from there. One option is that you can actually document all the alarms and notifications and triggers that you've configured, export that out via APIs, right, and actually store that as code. That way, when you deploy new vCenters, rather than having to create that in your vCenter server, it actually can come from your source code repository. So it does take a little bit of investigation to export that in. There are a number of scripts out there. In fact, I think Luke probably has some stuff around alarms, if I recall correctly. And then I think I wrote something for roles and permissions. And so it gets tricky, because if all of your vCenter has the exact same layout in terms of inventory structure, you can, at a high level, apply some of that configuration. In certain cases, not all of your vCenters will look exactly the same, and depending on how you map your roles and permission, it may be very difficult to take what you've got in one vCenter and automatically apply that to the next vCenter, or you may not want that at all. So it really depends. So I think one simpler solution is to kind of understand what you've got configured, figure out what is the commonality, try to extract that information either from an existing vCenter, or if you know what those are, start to create those automation scripts. I think Terraform is a great example in this case, where you can start to define your desired state. And here you can actually check against it. So it's not only do you duplicate this mapping of the alarms, your configuration, but you can also ensure that is it out of sync. Imagine if somebody went in and maybe deleted a particular alarm. You really have no way after that initial synchronization. So a nice thing about things like Terraform, Ansible, and this kind of infrastructure as code operation is that you can define this in your source code, right? And you can actually run compliance report against it. From a native capability standpoint, this is something that we had discussed at last VMworld, and I think there are some topics around it even at this VMworld, is that just like we had the concept of host profiles for an ESXi host, we took that an extra step level and we abstract that away to our new VLCM service, where we're trying to do desired state at a cluster level rather than individual ESX hosts. We're actually taking that same concept, right? And we actually apply that to the Vcenter server. So last year we talked a little bit about a tech preview called Vcenter Profiles. And as part of that capability, there are a number of things that we're basically allowing you to describe the desired state, things like NTP settings, and I believe roles and permissions were part of that. And so now you can actually take that information, and this is available in Vsphere 7, if I recall correctly. There are some early tech previews of that, and you can actually extract away the things that you care about, and that becomes your host profile, but now for vCenter. And we're certainly looking to explore that area a lot more to see what other configurations we want to capture. And that allows you to really stamp out multiple vCenter servers and apply this profile. And it has the same concept as desired state, as well as things like host profile, where we do have remediation and compliance checking built into the service. So depending on the version of vCenter they're using and depending on what you're trying to replicate, there may be something that you could leverage from VMware in terms of automation and APIs that's part of vSphere natively. Hopefully that helped answer that particular question. Okay, let's see. I know it hasn't even closed yet, but what are your thoughts on the SaltStack acquisition and how might it fit in the portfolio? That's a great question. I was actually not aware of the SaltStack acquisition until the news came out, so that was pretty interesting. You know, I know we have a lot of VMware customers actually using Salt. In fact, when that announcement came out, it saw a bunch of like tweets out for a lot of customers that had already kind of moved away from kind of traditional config management tools to kind of some of these modern ones. And it just adds on to the portfolio. And I think the way I would look at that is that it's just yet another tool that we see demand from our customers. And you look at our vRealize stack, right? Really one of the key tenets of the solution is not only multiple infrastructures that it supports, but it gives you this automatic governance, right? That's not always easy to replicate or build out. You know, almost every single organization has some type of process. And 9 out of 10 times, you know, that can be codified into some tooling, or at least have tooling to help you with that. And as you've seen over the years, you know, we've extended not just the types of languages. I think somebody had mentioned, you know, VRO now support for PowerShell, Python, Node, and JavaScript, right? It's not just the explicit languages, but it's also the different types of automation tools. So we're seeing integrations with things like Puppet, CloudFormation, even Azure for desired states. There's some Terraform plugins. And so to me, SaltStack is just yet another piece of that puzzle, not only for desired state, but also configuration management, right? That's a big area that hasn't really been solved and not everybody's doing it. And so you can imagine, you know, VMware wanting to provide a capability for that as part of that overall end-to-end automation services. So, you know, I'm not sure what plans that they have, but I'm sure that it's going to be well received by the existing customer base, and certainly will add more capabilities to the vRealize stack for those of you that are currently using it. So. Let's see. Okay, so this is a question from Patrick. So let's see. He said he recently committed some code to the Python client for VMware Cloud AWS. Fantastic. This was his first venture making an API call. I mostly copied existing code and did a bunch of trial and error to get it work. You know, that's the best definition of a sysadmin, right? Is it's never writing your own code. It's like, you know, you're the best when you're able to leverage other people's code to really do your work. And so I think that's a great way of looking at things. Would you talk through how you go about turning a VMC API call into easier use function? I feel like I was kind of stumbling through the API Explorer systematic control way to do it. Yeah, that's a great question. let's take a look at an environment. Let me see if I can log into my VMware Cloud AWS environments. There's actually a couple of ways. And we can also look at GitHub. Let's see. Nfxt. Let's see. So yeah, so there's a couple of places. I think anytime you get started with any kind of API, it's very daunting. I think a lot of people want to start out by just saying, hey, I want to solve this big problem. And oftentimes, before you get into it, because what you'll find, at least when I start with automation, is that if you don't understand a lot of the basic, the organization structure of the APIs, for example, in the Vsphere APIs, really understanding the object model, and that, there is this kind of host VM folder networking view. And even with VMware Cloud and AWS, understanding, hey, are there these different objects? How's the networking APIs kind of interact with it? And sometimes it is just kind of looking at documentation. There is a lot of trial and error. Even when I wrote a lot of the automation, it is some trial and error. Fortunately, with something like VMware Cloud and AWS and the integration with the API Explorer, you can start to try out the APIs. And so when I first started with the Nsxt APIs, I really did not know it very well, right? I knew kind of the high level, and one of the nice things that's been redesigned is our our front-facing developer experience interfaces for our RESTful APIs. And so now, instead of just the Swagger file, you have something that's a little bit more easy to browse, for example, right? So this is kind of the SCDC APIs, and start to look at the different namespaces or endpoints and figure out what's available. And the nice thing about VMC and this API Explorer is that, so when you come into the Developer Center, this is very similar to the Developer Center for Vsphere, you're familiar with that. And this capability actually came from the VMware Cloud team, where we said, hey, it would be really great if I can actually specify my SDDC, and it's automatically context aware of the SDDC. And so if I come into this general SDDC, for example, right, I can come in here and I can select the SDDC, and when I do a git operation, it actually automatically fills in the context. And so right here, without writing a single piece of code, I can actually explore what this git API does, and it renders the information, so I can actually view it and see, hey, this is the information, this is the org, this is the ID. And so it is in this very exploratory phase. A lot of times you're going to be new to the API, and so you're not really sure how is it organized. Are the API names mapped to the particular feature name, which may or may not be the case. And so being able to explore the actual API, so something like an API Explorer, is certainly going to be very helpful. And then secondly to that, you start to take a look at what are the outputs and how do you start to construct the information. And going back to Patrick's question is like, how do you take this very raw API, right, which is kind of lowest level common denominator, how do you abstract that away? And I tend to look at, the PowerCLI or PowerShell module that I wrote for Nsxt for VMware Cloud and AWS. And it's all about breaking these things up, right? And when you look at, PowerCLI, when you connect to Vsphere, you have kind of a connect commandlet, right? One of the things that you normally need to do with any type of API is to basically authenticate yourself, right? And you probably don't want to authenticate with every single API call. And so I broke out that and said, I was like, hey, I need to talk to the reverse proxy. There's this token that I need to pass in. So I created a really basic function. And if you think about it, this is very similar, akin to kind of what we do with PowerCLI, is that you look at some of these commandlets, it sometimes will actually abstract away one or oftentimes many different APIs to give you this higher level business value that you're trying to solve for. And the example of that git SCDC, you probably don't want the entire SCDC payload, right? So this is literally the entire SCDC payload. If I expand this, or if I expand this out, we have cluster information, I have all this information, right? And you probably don't care about that, right? And this tends to overwhelm people. When you think about a git SCDC, you might just want to know what's the name of the SCDC, maybe the number of hosts. And so really it's like sort of, what is your goal? What are you trying to do with this particular API? Is it a Git informational API? Is it to affect change into the system? And generally I start out with kind of Git APIs. This is kind of what Alan, myself, and others have talked about, is that if you're new to an API, any API that is a Git, you can't do any harm. You can still do harm, but generally you're generally safe, right? And figure out the pieces of information that you're looking at and start to write out that code, right? That can be as easy as using like a curl command if you're familiar with that. Maybe you're more comfortable with PowerShell, so you might use something like an invoked REST client or invoked web request and start to parse out that and save that to a variable so you can kind of see what information is in there, and then selectively pick out the things that you're interested in. So if I go back to my Nsxt example, after I created the function that handles authentication, so at the end, it just saves it to this little variable, and I'm able to reference, the endpoints, all the headers, right? So I'm not having to reduplicate this, right? And so I start to break out the pieces, and again, it's something that you'll start to think about, like what level of simplicity are you looking for? So example, when I do my get Nsxt network segments, I'm only interested in a couple of different parameters. And so here I've constructed the URL, right? I'm gonna do a get on that request. And here, when I created this function, there's kind of two things I was thinking about. I was like, okay, for one customer, I might want to retrieve all the different network segments. And for that use case, I need to collect all the result of that, right? And then output that in a certain way. And because I'm using PowerShell, it's great to put this in kind of an object format, right? Because that means I can take this and run it through a pipeline. I can do all sorts of things. I can take this and actually convert the output, which is a list of objects, into a JSON package, for example, if you wanted to store this as source code. Maybe it's converting to an XML document, right? And so maybe thinking about how the consumer might use it. So when I built this piece of this function, it was really, there's different use cases for it. So I built it in a fairly generic fashion. You might say, oh yeah, I need it in a particular format. So you might convert this straight to JSON and you don't have to do this object processing. But if you want this to be easily interoperable with other commandlets, you might want to make it generic, kind of what we do with PowerCLI and kind of piping objects to objects. In addition to that, some customers say, well, I don't want all the Nsxt commandlets or segments. I might just want one of them. So that tells me like, okay, this function should not only dump out all the different segments, I should also offer some filtering. So when you look at the parameters, when I create this function, this is an option. It's not a required parameter, but if I happen to pass in a name, what I'm going to do is I'm still going to retrieve all the Nsxt segments because there's not a filtering option there when we retrieve those segments. But what I can do is I can actually filter at a later point, right? And say, hey, if the user gave me a specific name, let me take a look at all the segments and let me filter that out. And then I will go and output that. And so again, when you think about how do you simplify, part of it is what is information you're looking for? Who's your consumer, right? Are you writing this for somebody else to use? Are you writing it so that you leave the door open for future integration? So maybe you might say, I need this in XML format, but maybe in the future I might need JSON. So maybe I will make it generic and just make it as an object, an array of object. And that way, if I need it in XML, I just pipe it to convert to XML. And maybe in the future, if I need to JSON, I don't need to rewrite this function. So it becomes reusable code. I know Luke does this all the time, is that he shares out these really awesome functions. And again, it tries to solve a very particular problem, doesn't try to boil the ocean, right? And these functions, whether it's PowerShell or any language for that matter, right, is very specific pieces of business logic that you're trying to accomplish. And the nice thing about PowerShell and many other languages is that you can put these things into kind of what's known as a module. And then you can import these. So if it's like a Java statement, you might import these libraries, right? And now you have access to these different functions. In PowerShell, I can put this into a module. I can then source control this. I can actually publish this on PowerShell Gallery, like this particular module it is. And so as you add more functionality, I can start to streamline these together. Another option is that making it generic allows you to reuse this function. So if I take a look at this get segments, I actually reuse this in my set segment. So when you retrieve a segment, I might want to change it from a connected state to a disconnected state. Rather than rewriting all of that code that I did for the retrieving the segment, I can actually reuse that function, right? And here, if I provide a particular name, right, I'm able to filter it here. And so here I'm actually using my own get network segment function. And so again, it's part of reusability. So you're not having to duplicate the code. And so it makes this very clean. It makes it such that somebody can just copy a particular function, right, and just reuse that piece of functionality. So again, it's something that it takes some time to kind of cover. So I don't know if that kind of helps answer your question, Patrick. Let's see. Oh, there's a question. Yeah, let me. Don't know if you're muted or if you're not. Let me paste that in there, but I'll also paste all the other modules that I've written. Let me see if I can recall. I think this also works too. And And you can also find all of my code on my GitHub repository as well too. So yeah, I mean, honestly, I think a lot of people will start learning by taking a look at what others have done. You know, honestly, I've done the same thing. You know, when I first got into PowerCLI, you know, I looked at what Luke was doing, what Kyle was doing, what Alan was doing, what Jake was doing, and many others in the community, right? And once you understand the particular API surface and how to kind of navigate it, like I said, in the Vsphere API, one of the most critical things that can really help you understand the API is understanding how it's all constructed. You know, how are the objects tied to each other? And there's a number of different tools to help you with that, right? You can use something like the Vsphere mob, which is this graphical interface that shows you these different objects. So you can kind of navigate it just like an API explorer for RESTful APIs. And once you get an understanding, understanding of the APIs, aligning that with examples that you've seen, start to write really basic Git functions, right? You know, inspect a particular API, output the data. You know, printing the statement is one of the most helpful things, so you can visually see what is the output, right? And then from there you can determine, okay, am I going to mash up multiple pieces of code together and start to build a solution? And then over time you might say, oh yeah, I'm better off, instead of rewriting this logic multiple times, I find a pattern, take that pattern, turn that into a reusable piece of function, right? And then you can start to aggregate these functions up where you can reuse them in different modules. You might be able to even share them out, right? And so again, that's you know, that's how I've gotten started. And I know that's how many other people have gotten started, right? So look at what's been done and really understanding the documentation, because it really does help you. If you just try to jump straight into the automation and just say, oh yeah, I'll just look at examples after examples, it could help you in the short term, but longer term, you might still be wondering, how does this API actually work, right? So something to consider. Let's see. What do you suggest for someone starting to learn PowerShell, PowerShell, and APIs and pertains to vSphere outside of just working with it on a regular basis? All I want to find is very basic training that usually turns to that. Turn that right. Specific vSphere. I just think of what people would just think of the logic, and I need to put that code together and be able to run in PowerCLI. Yeah, you know, I'm not sure if we used to have these training sessions at VMware. I'm not sure if we still have them. We might still have a couple of PowerCLI, because I think there were PowerCLI, because that's certainly one of the most popular ones. But there are definitely content out there around learning about the APIs. I think honestly, you can always look at documentation. And that's only going to get you so far. You know, it's really getting hands-on. In terms of hands-on approach, you know, the best hands-on is if you've got a real environment, right? And it doesn't have to be something that you own necessarily. You can actually use something like VMware Hands-on Labs, right? It's a free service. You start any particular lab, especially the PowerCLI lab. I think this week it's actually the most popular session doing VMware Cloud automation and even Terraform automation, right? So if you don't have a VMware Cloud AWS infrastructure, you know, it's a good way to start there. And so it doesn't have to be your own home lab, but ideally you use that. There are a number of API explorers. Like I said, you know, Vsphere has both the API explorer that's built into the UI. We also have something called code capture. So there you might be more comfortable. Now this is specifically for the Vsphere SOAP APIs. We're starting to slowly take a look at what this might look like for our new RESTful APIs, but the idea is that you can perform some operation in the UI. That's generally where most people kind of get started learning about the piece of functionality, right? For example, you might want to create a VM, put in a particular folder. You're not sure exactly which API. Well, the nice thing about the API Explorer and the code capture is that in the Vsphere UI, you click on the record button, and you perform an operation, it will actually capture all those API calls. And then after you're done, you can actually see the raw APIs. And then from there, you can say, okay, that's how the UI instrumented that piece of automation. I can actually search for that piece of code, right? So that's another option. Another thing too is we also have a tool that's called the Vcsim, or GoVMami Vcsim, and it basically simulates the Vcenter API. It's very lightweight. It's like a couple of megabytes. And I believe there's some interfaces even for the RESTful API, but the idea there is that you have the object model that's represented in this kind of simulator tool. And so then you can use PowerCLI, you can use any of the different SDKs and CLIs and interact with this environment, right? So if you imagine you want to start to just learn about, you know, how do I manage data stores, for example, and you don't have the different types of data store, you can actually use a simulation tool and go and create a data store object, right? It'll go and manifest this in the simulation tool, and you can kind of explore with it. It doesn't, again, it's not a replacement for the real thing. And I know that there are some videos on YouTube. There probably aren't as many in terms of the API stuff. I think you'll probably end up finding most of the content most likely on either my blog or on Luke's blog, Alan's and Kyle's blog. And from there, you start to get an idea of what are the PowerShell high-level commandlets and maybe some of the lower-level APIs. Hopefully that helped a little bit. Let's see, what is the name of this? Let me search for that name real quick. It's like Go Vcsim, I think. Here we go. So here's the project. So it's a small little Go binary. And in fact, a lot of our developers are actually using that internally to do development. And so that's one that they've been keeping up to date. And so you can actually spin up a vSphere inventory, a very lightweight inventory, right? Hosts, VMs, folders. They've started to do content library and all these things too. So you can actually start to interact with multiple of these APIs. And it's a great way to get started, right? If you don't have a real environment. And again, if you want something that's a little bit more tangible, Hands-On Labs is a free service. And so a lot of people don't realize like, hey, it's there for you, right? Anybody can sign up, take a lab. And instead of taking the specific lab that they've got, you can actually explore the environment a little bit. Imagine if you want to do some automation with SRM, right? And we also have some PowerCLI labs in there too that can walk you through some of that. So hopefully that'll be some good pointers for you to kind of get started. Let's see. Just feels like skipping. Let's see, is there any other questions that I missed?
I think you have a couple.
Oh, do I?
So you have a couple from D. When comparing Terraform versus PowerShell for Nsxt code management, which would you recommend and why?
Let's see, PowerShell. So comparing Terraform versus PowerShell for Nsxt code management. What do you mean by that, D? When you
Let me just unmute.
Yeah, sorry, code management, I meant to say writing code to facilitate management of the Nsxt, like either running various operations on Nsxt. Is it better to use it Terraform or PowerCLI?
When you say running code, can you give me an example of
if we have to like create new new network sets? Is it better to use Terraform or?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So let me here, I'll share this one. Don't have the Terraform example specifically. So here's a here's a good example of the, let's see, do I have, so there's a couple ways of looking at it. The nice thing about Terraform is that, you know, you remove yourself from necessarily understanding the APIs to kind of what you want to achieve, right? And that's really the concept of an infrastructure as code. Rather than you learning about a particular solutions API, and this includes VMware, you're more worried about what do you want that insight to look like. And you're using code in a sense of not writing, you know, a traditional imperative piece of code where you're kind of saying, okay, I need to connect to the interface. I need to get this information, construct the API call, make a call, and make sure that I create this segment, for example, right? Instead of doing all that and knowing about the API, you can just say, you know what, for this particular solution, I want a segment, I want it to be connected, and I want it to have this DHCP configuration. And that's my desired state. And from an infrastructure as code standpoint, it's a great solution because not only can you codify that in a very easy to read input file via the YAML input, it also ensures that that state will always be delivered. You know, to give you an example, if I create an Nsxt segment today, right, from after that, there's nobody monitoring that segment. Another user can come and accidentally delete it. They can actually make a change. You'll never know. So imagine if you started to deploy these workloads, and then the next day, the developers are like, hey, you know, DHCP is not working. And you're like, what do you mean? I created the segment, and then you go into Nsxt, and you're like, oh, crap. Somebody came in here and disabled DHCP. You would never know that. When you look at a more modern option using something like Terraform, Ansible, as such, is not only is it making it simpler for you to deliver that automation, but you can actually run those policies against it over time to make sure that that environment always has that desired state. So if DHCP was turned off for whatever reason and your initial desired state says that DHCP should be turned on, right, it'll go ahead and affect that environment immediately and make that change. Another aspect of it is also, you know, what are you trying to do and what type of automation, what functionality is available? If you look at the Nsxt provider specifically for Terraform, we covered the large breadth of all the functionality that you can do. And so you can easily describe, you know, segments in just a couple of lines of YAML, right? And apply that configuration change and it'll go and create the segment. Now, if you look at it from a traditional imperative model, you have to learn the Nsxt APIs. It can be quite daunting when you just jump into Nsxt. Now, I've done some work here where I've actually created these modules. So creating an Nsxt segment is as simple as, you know, new Nsxt segment, DHCP range, right? And so I've kind of done the job of creating this higher level function, and you can easily add to it if you want to explore the API a little bit more, or, you know, VMware might have like a high level commandlets, right? But you're still having to write all this logic. You're having to write, you know, what happens if you ran your automation code accidentally twice? Well, Nsxt doesn't care about the name being unique because it uses a UUID. So what happens here is if I run this piece of code twice, what I actually end up getting is 2 Nsxt segments, right? And it actually allows you to have this duplication of name because, you know, I did not realize like, oh yeah, maybe I should do a git first to make sure that I didn't create the segment and it doesn't exist already, right? So you're having to worry more about the boilerplate code rather than what you're trying to accomplish, which is like, hey, I need 20 segments defined and this is what it should look like. And when we look at it from the Terraform point of view, right, you define those 20 networks, you can run that Terraform plan 1,000 times, right? It's not going to make any changes if it already exists in the infrastructure, right? So it's, this is a concept called idempotency, right? So you can apply that thing n number of times and the result will always be the same. Whereas if you look at traditional scripting, programming, imperative languages, you have to write all that logic in together. So part of it is a trade-off between complexity of the API and whether you want to basically give up that, you know, learning and just say, hey, I want to consume it at a much higher level of abstraction. Just like, you know, in the early days, you're installing ESX, you install vCenter, you install all the different components and configure. And now you can basically purchase VMware Cloud Foundation. You now get an SDDC. You've abstracted away how you construct your SDDC. Same thing with automation, right? You can either build it piecemeal and understand the APIs, and sometimes the APIs may not be consistent. There may be different tools you need to mix and match. And with infrastructure as code, you move away from that and you're able to define your end state. So it all depends, you know, which APIs you're looking at. If you look at VMware Cloud and AWS's Terraform provider, it's still very early stages. It covers a lot of the high-level lifecycle management operations. So create an SDDC, delete, update, scale out, but it may not cover all the things like maybe extending an SDDC or maybe creating an SDDC grouping. So there you might actually have some constraints of the infrastructure as code providers, whereas the API has all that basic functionality. And so you might say, I need these pieces of functionality. Maybe it's not available in the Terraform provider or maybe Ansible module. You might want to use the APIs. And so it really depends on kind of like what your goals are ultimately. But this is a good example when you start to look at something like Nsxt. It's sort of like, do you want to learn the APIs or do you want to basically use the product and rely on some other solution to kind of deliver the end state that you're looking for? Hopefully that helped. Let's see. Cool, awesome. Oh, are my replies not going into the chat window? I guess maybe not. Not sure how else can. Are you seeing my replies, Kripa?
Yeah, I'm seeing your replies. I think it was just he had asked questions earlier, but there's more chat that came in through. But I think you answered it now. I think we're actually fully caught up on questions.
Oh, perfect. I think we have. What are we ending at?
Right on top of the hour, 2:59.
Awesome.
Amazing.
Hopefully this was helpful. I think this was my first time doing it. So I think if this is something that you guys are interested in, you know, please let Kripa know. I think there's a survey that's available after the CodeCon Connect. So let her know what you guys like, didn't like, things we can improve upon. And happy to do these types of conversations, whether it's just chatting it or jumping into code. I know we didn't really get into coding today, but lots of fantastic questions and this kind of stuff that I really enjoy talking about. And you know, some of the options and things that we're seeing with what our customers are doing with automation. So really appreciate that.
Quick last question for you. Do you have the link to the Vcsim tool?
Yeah, it's a thing I just pasted. Here, let me paste it again. Is it making it in? Maybe that's, yeah. It's
No,
weird.
it is. I mean, I can see it.
Got it.
But yeah, awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. I'm gonna crack one of your sessions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. And yeah, if people want to fill out the survey, I would really appreciate it. But yeah, thanks, William.
Cool. Thanks, you guys. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.